Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this year's Gordon Goodman Memorial Lecture. My name is Dan Larhammar, and I'm the president of the Academy of Sciences. This event is organized in collaboration with the Stockholm Environment Institute and Stockholm University. Usually this lecture takes place at the Academy of Sciences, but this year our building is undergoing a major facelift, so we are pleased and grateful that our sister academy, the Royal Swedish Academy of Agriculture and Forestry, is kindly hosting this event. Gordon Goodman was a British ecologist who worked for many years in Swansea and then London. He received a fellowship to spend periods of time in Sweden to learn methods to detect and measure organic mercury in aquatic systems. He managed to raise government's awareness about environment and the necessity of global environmental monitoring. In 1977, he became the founding director of the Behavioural Institute that opened under the auspices of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, focusing on energy systems. This initiative was positive thanks to the financial support from the Kjell and Märta Beyer Foundation and continues to operate to this day. The Institute subsequently changed its focus in 1991 to ecological economics. In 1983, Gordon Goodman was elected a foreign member of the Academy of Sciences. And in the mid-1980s, he and Professor Bert Bolin, also an Academy member, had initiated the IPCC that was formed formally in 1988, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Bolin was the first president of the IPCC during 10 years. In 1989, the Stockholm Environment Institute was set up by the Swedish government, and Gordon Goodman became the first director and served until the year after, focusing on sustainable agriculture, biotechnology, and other matters. After his retirement, he moved back to England, and he passed away in 2008 at the age of 82. The Academy of Sciences has a strong and deep interest in global sustainability and has had a role also in several other institutes. We are the proud hosts of both the Beyer Institute and of Global Economic Dynamics and the Biosphere, GEDB, a 5-year research program funded by the Erling Persson Family Foundation. We had a role in the International Geosphere-Biosphere Program, IGBP, that was in operation until 2015. Already in 2012, we had a new initiative that was launched with our help, namely the Future Earth Program, which subsequently became an independent institute. And this is a 10-year international research program focusing on global change and sustainable development. It has hubs in 5 places, on 3 different continents, and one of these hubs is here in Stockholm. Stockholm Resilience Center was launched in 2007 through a collaboration between us and the Stockholm Environment Institute, and it is a joint initiative with Stockholm University and the Beyer Institute. It is important to emphasize that many of these efforts are quite interdisciplinary and involve not only the natural sciences and technology, but also social sciences and the humanities. Economy, law, science communication, and human psychology are important aspects of sustainable development. And because all of these areas of expertise are represented in our academy, we are convinced that we can contribute constructively to sustainable development and to spreading information about this. So does this year's Gordon Goodman Memorial Lecture, Sverker Sörlin. So I very much look forward to hearing the lecture and the subsequent panel discussion. But first I will pass the word on to a colleague in the Academy of Sciences who is today wearing a different hat, Professor Astrid Söderbergh, Widding. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, as president of Stockholm University, It is a true pleasure for me to join with my colleagues from the Royal Academy of Sciences and Stockholm Environment Institute in welcoming you all to the Gordon Goodman Memorial Lecture 2019. And especially, of course, today's speaker, Professor Sverker Sörlin, as well as the invited panel. It's only 5 years ago that Stockholm University joined in this collaboration on co-arranging the Gordon Goodman Lecture, but we are extremely pleased and proud to take part in this important annual event and co-arranging it. We have a long history, though, of collaborating with the Royal Academy of Sciences, not least since the university moved to Campus Frescati and we became neighbors. We are co-hosting and collaborating on a number of different important centers and projects. To mention only 2 examples, Stockholm Resilience Center, that was already mentioned, and the Bergianska Botanical Gardens. Stockholm Environment Institute has also been an important strategic partner for Stockholm University for a number of years. We cooperate not only on an individual level between researchers, but also structurally at the leadership level. I have the honor to serve on the board of SEI since 2013, and this creates a specific relationship where we share strategic visions between our 2 institutions. Today, we also specifically commemorate the 30-year jubilee of the Stockholm Environment Institute, when Gordon Goodman also became its first director. So our warmest congratulations to SEI on behalf of Stockholm University. One of the greatest strengths, research-wise, at Stockholm University concerns sustainability, climate, and environment. Here we are ranked among the top 10 in the world. Climate, seas, and environment is one of our profile areas, and climate and economy another, which also testifies to the breadth of our research in these areas, which is truly interdisciplinary and spans across all faculties. The Academy, the Stockholm Environment Institute, and the university have different missions, and we put different emphasis on our shared questions. The aim of the Academy is to promote the sciences. At Stockholm University, we do scientific research, education, and outreach, whereas the SEI bridges science and policy. Therefore, it strengthens us all to join forces. In a world where sustainable development, climate change, and environmental issues are being questioned by many forces, this is all the more important. In order to realize our common vision for sustainable development for the future, researchers and policymakers, civil society and business have to come together, both to make even further scientific progress, but also to bring about necessary changes, technologically as well as societally. Once again, welcome. And I now hand over the floor to Måns Nilsson, Director of Stockholm Environment Institute.
Ladies and gentlemen, what a pleasure to be here again at KSLA, also a close partner with us for many years. It was actually Gordon Goodman's concept that brought me into SEI in the first place. I was an intern at the UNDP in New York, and my supervisor there had connections to SEI. He brought me in touch with Michael Chadwick, the director that was coming after Gordon. And Mike, I came to Stockholm, I met with Michael. He was shown me a memo that Gordon Goodman had produced, 5 pages, called The Earth Audit. And he told me, well, Måns, you are an economist, and of course we know what the supply of sustainability is, but what is the demand? So I was actually employed to try to answer that question, which was obviously impossible. And perhaps that concept note needed some further rethinking and thinking, but it was indeed the time I came into SEI, and at that time Gordon was also a member of our board, and I met him. But enough about Gordon now. Another person with the capacity to take a long view is Sverker Sörlin. So with this anniversary celebration of SEI's 30 years, who better to deliver our annual Gordon Goodman lecture? Sverker is a historian, an author, professor in the Division of History of Science, Technology and Environment at KTH, Royal Institute of Technology. With a PhD in History of Science and Ideas, he has been a professor of environmental history for many years, first at Umeå University and then at KTH since 2002. He's also been visiting researcher at Berkeley, Cambridge, University of Oslo, Cape Town, and the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. He was part of launching the KTH Environmental Humanities Laboratory, of which he was a co-founder in 2011. And I've personally been very enthusiastic reading his history of ideas and the grasping title, Mörkret i människan, the human darkness. So he's also been actually very active in the field of research policy and environmental policy and has served as an advisor to the government on these topics for many years since the mid-1990s. And today his research interests covers a breadth of the history of the human-earth relationship and the emergence of the environment in societal discourse and practice. So without further ado, welcome up, Sverker.
Dear environmentalists, I wanted to say that am I heard here?
Let me go to that mic.
Okej, nu hörs jag. Vi börjar om. Dear environmentalists, I need not tell you that it is a great honor for me to stand here in front of you today and to have been asked to give this year's Gordon Goodman lecture, especially since it is the 30th anniversary of SEI this year. So we honor the leadership demonstrated by Gordon Goodman, his foresight and insight, and his vision for this great institution that now spans the world after a string of successful leaders and so many dedicated staff. Although we are in temporary quarters here, it is perhaps only doubly fitting that we are in the building of the Royal Swedish Academy of Agriculture and Forestry, of which I happen to be a member, and where environmental issues have a home, as they have in so many institutions and organizations in Stockholm. A green city of the world, perhaps the greenest, but not without competition. For example, with the San Francisco Bay Area. About a decade ago at a conference in Paris, I came across Richard Walker, a Berkeley geographer who had written a book about the green history of the Bay Area. And from the podium he stated, somewhat pompously actually, that it was the green capital of the world where he lived in the Bay Area. His book is fantastic. You can see the cover here. But in the Q&A, I rose and said, I'm not so sure. It might be Stockholm. And I asked for his evidence and so on. So we quibbled in a friendly way over this and kept doing it actually for many years. And we ended up in a book together. You can see this here. Just recently published by the MIT Press that I co-edited with my colleague and former PhD student Henrik Ernstrom. What does it mean to be the green capital of the world? It can't just be that you have the largest amount of green space. If so, the greenest cities would be the ones with very few houses and super big forests. So let me tell you this story. Many years ago, I hosted this man, the famous philosopher Eugenio Trias from Barcelona, who passed away a few years ago. I was in Umeå then. I took the philosopher in my car on some spare hours, and we drove around Umeå, a city that grew in the era of car traffic, as you may know, and hence is very sprawling, almost like a loose agglomeration of villages, all with low houses, almost like shoeboxes, with occasional grayish high-rises. It was a perfectly grey day in the middle of March in Umeå. Low clouds, depressive. And we came to one of those places on the very outskirts of town where you can only turn your car around. And between you and the forest, there are only these green metal recycling bins. Trias had been silent for a long time. And you must remember, we are not talking about just anybody. He's the winner of the Nietzsche Prize, the Nobel Prize of Philosophy, things like that. 50 books or something had written. But in that moment, when we had almost stopped and were turning around, he said in a sort of profound philosophical way, "This reminds me of Novosibirsk." and he then described Novosibirsk to me. He'd been there. 1 million people in villages of about the same kind. The only thing that was the buildings were even higher. And with lots of tundra in between. So, Stockholm is green in a different way. Not primarily because it is a lot of nature between the buildings. Actually, there is quite a bit of that here too. But because it is a lot of green spirit inside the buildings. And one of these buildings is that where SEI has its headquarters, needless to say. An organization with environment in its name must have this spirit. 30 years ago, it was the obvious word to use for a name of such an organization. But only 2 decades earlier, in the late 60s, the Swedish EPA, Naturvårdsverket, still had this word nature in its name, Protection Agency. And since 1989, we have seen the birth of centers, institutes, and organizations around concepts such as sustainability, Anthropocene, resilience, climate, earth, planetary. So it's time to think about the environment. How can we understand this growing diversity? How is the environment faring in this growing ecosystem of concepts? Are there other concepts, invasive concepts? Is environment a threatened one? We may think about that this afternoon. And the most fundamental question of all, this thing that is all around us, that we call the environment, where did it come from? I'm an historian, and in its 30 years, SEI hasn't, as far as I know, hired so many historians. Perhaps they weren't thought as very much needed. And that may be true. Historians didn't discover or invent the environment. That's not why I'm here today to tell you that. In fact, historians are often a bit late to arrive. And actually, often when things have already started to go into the past. But there are exceptions, I can tell you that too. And you could also say that actually in this particular case of the environment, historians were somehow around. And let me start there. They didn't fully know what was going on, but they were around. One of the most influential history books in the second half of the 20th century was this small volume by Edward Hallam Carr, What is History? It is based on his Trevelyan lectures in Cambridge in 1961, as you can see there, and since then read by generations of historians and their students. Really one of the most read books. Wise and witty, but also strange in some ways to our contemporary ears, in the way some things become strange with time. But Carr is also ahead of his time in speaking very eloquently about interdisciplinarity. History and science are noble arts, he says, working together for the same goal, and here I quote him, to increase man's understanding of and mastery over his environment. That's on page 111. Now this was 1961, the year before Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. The downside of this word mastery wasn't fully established yet, although the earth was already trembling with Silent Spring and other events coming up, as we shall see. Carr's point was not so much the environment, but rather the status of history. In order to stay relevant, remain, as he said, even more difficult than the classics. He wanted to really beat them, and at least as serious as science. So it needed to use, history needed to use the methods of science. Carr in Cambridge disliked the dualism of his predecessor, R.G. Collingwood, who was in Oxford, an earlier historian, who had argued that humans were the only ones who had a history. Because history was about agency, and agency requires intentionality or will. And that came ultimately from God, Collingwood insisted. Only humans had this little fragment of the divine inside them. And therefore the story of humans must be separated from the stories of the rest of creation. And while we listen, we can look at the cover of Silent Spring. Carr was quite materialist, in fact a Marxist, had started to distrust that separation. History was not just about human action, it was also of some importance what happened in the surrounding material elements, so to speak. And he cited C.P. Snow, the chemist and novelist who had given his Reed lectures on the two cultures just a couple of years before, and had denounced the humanist scholars by talking about their antisocial feeling, as he called it. Humanists had antisocial feeling. Carr was acutely afraid that historians would be counted among these humanists, the literary intellectuals. And why? That meant not to be taken seriously. He was afraid of that. So Carr had a very developed sense of disciplinary politics. To keep crisis away, to stay relevant, it was a good idea to align history with real-world changes and what could be more real than changes in nature, and thus with the biological and geological sciences. Now, this may not sound so radical now, but it was then. And just how immensely radical it was, we can understand if we compare it with the understanding of another historian who was even more famous than Carr, namely this man here, Fernand Braudel, from France, with an important teaching period in Brazil in the 1930s, where he met with colleagues who wrote history about the Amazon and of large-scale colonial encounters between humans and nature. Braudel's fame comes from having introduced geography and thus the environment into history with his colleagues in the so-called Annales school, so named after a journal that they founded in 1928. But this thing with entering the environment and geography was actually later. After years as a prisoner of war in Lübeck, Braudel published a huge book with the title L'Histoire de la Méditerranée, you can see it here, in some later editions, a history of the Mediterranean, finished in 1947 and published in 1949. The timing here is of some significance. Braudel divided historical time into three temporalities. The time of événement, as he called it, the short, speedy things on the time scale of seconds, hours, days, and weeks, where events happen, really. And the time of conjoncture, years, decades, possibly generations. These were time scales that had always been familiar to historians, so nothing new there. Then he added the third time scale, la longue durée, the long term. And this longue durée was linked to what he called la part du milieu, the role of the environment, which he presented in his quite remarkable introduction, as he called it, 350 pages, to his book that was close to 1,000 pages. And that is what most historians refer to when they tell the story of the environment and how it entered history. It happened through Braudel, environment, or geography, and la longue durée, this combination. And the line is drawn often from there to later historians who start to apply Braudel's work and appreciate his use of the environment as the important arena which forms the backdrop of human action. So Braudel brings the environment in It is a towering achievement, no doubt about that, along with his remarkable separations of the timescales that I mentioned. These ideas and his role also in the invention of social history in the 1950s is enough to explain why he has been called the greatest historian of the 20th century. But what environment was it that Brodell introduced? Well, actually, if you read him carefully, and a few times, you start seeing this clearly, and you can compare it to today. It was a remarkably modest version of the environment, an undramatic nature, changing very slowly indeed. In fact, he called it quasi-immobile, almost not moving at all. Environment as the slow variable, a background on which human drama appeared. And the human drama, les événements, les conjonctures, moved much faster. We recognize this idea, don't we? We hear it these days when we talk about climate change. We hear that climate change is not visible to the eye. It is obscured by the drastic changes of the weather that goes up and down like this, particularly in a country like Sweden. So in order to detect climate change, we need data. And when we got the data, we suddenly realized, oh yes, change is faster than we thought. And we know this now very well. But Brodell didn't. And he didn't change his mind on this point. Still in the new introduction to the English translation of his work in 1974, 2 years after the UN meeting on the environment in Stockholm. So there was nothing, the politics was out there. He's not willing to accept his student, Emmanuel Leroy-Ladury's work on climate change. Ladurie had worked on weather records from winemaking. The historian must not believe that nature changes very quickly. So primarily, agency still stays in society. Brodell's environment was there, but not yet fully historical. It can be of some interest to quote in this moment one of those dangerous literary intellectuals, Roland Barthes, writing in the middle of the decade, the 1950s, that separated Brodell and Carr 61, Brodell 49, in his book Mythologie from 1957. And I will cite him in English here. Just a brief quote. Progressive humanism, Barthes says, progressive humanism must always remember to reverse the terms, constantly to scour nature, its laws and its limits, he puts these words in goose eyes, in order to discover history there, and at last to establish nature itself as historical. Barthes, a mere thinker, managed to see through this haze. Nature is not absolute, it is not slow, it is historical. And what does that mean? It means that it is subject to change, just like anything else. And few historians would agree to that 60 years ago. And we should particularly note the word limits, because it's very important to the discourse of the environment. Sometimes it's called boundaries. It is important to remind ourselves of this moment, not too long ago. It was about the time I was born, actually. As the post-war period was winding on, how a new discussion of nature and environment was swelling up, and how it drew creative minds across all fields of knowledge. I just gave you history here and a bit of literary scholarship, including humanists, social scientists, and the rest of it. We have become so used to thinking about the environment as the domain of the natural sciences. And yes, it turned out that way. But in this formative moment of the environment, the academic division of labor about environment was not yet fully established. But it didn't take long before it was. So let's return to Latin America. Just a few years after Brodell had his revelatory moments as an historian in Brazil, an American ornithologist and ecologist, William Vogt, was inventing species in the jungles of Honduras and Guatemala and other countries. Already then, way before the red lists had become in wide circulation, he found a beginning of species loss. He saw serious disturbances of ecosystems. He observed soil erosion, over-harvesting of forests. And Vogt was deeply worried. He wrote concerned reports to several governments in that region. And after the war, he collated his findings into a book with this title, Road to Survival. Really a pamphlet, a rallying cry, a diatribe, a really, really strong book. And the book made an enormous impression. It was translated into multiple languages, including Swedish. It sold millions of copies, and it appeared in a Reader's Digest version, the ultimate sign of consecration in Cold War America. In the book appeared this word, environment, the same word as Brodel had used, although with certain difference. Brodel said in French, as you noted, milieu, not quite the same. Brodel's term echoed more of the old understanding, going back centuries, in fact, all the way back to antiquity. The words could be different. They could be nature, geography, or even climate, or klima, as the Greeks said, referring to the distance from the equator. These were all important factors that steered humans, that made their societies different. These ideas had always been around, and they became widely popular in the 18th and 19th centuries and ran high into the 20th century as well, then under the name environmental determinism. It could be used to argue that it was climatic conditions that explained why people were poor in Africa and why New England had the optimal climate for intelligence. The infamous conclusion in the book Civilization and Climate by geographer Ellsworth Huntington, published in 1915. And of course, Huntington himself was from New England. And you now wonder, what was his method to write this book? Well, he wrote letters to 200 colleagues around the world, esteemed geographers, and asked them to rank regions around the world with reference to intelligence. And they, of course, all knew that Huntington taught at Yale, and they wanted to be polite. So some of this determining tinge was still there in Brodel. Environment and climate set the stage. Humans act. Humans write the script, perform the play. But when you hear the concerned ornithologist, Vogt, you hear something very, very different. For him, environment was something else. It is that thing out there that humans both are dependent on for their survival, that they create through their actions, and above all, that they destroy through their greed, their short-sightedness, their carelessness, and sheer clumsiness. Humans, each and every one born so gifted, are dumb as a species. Or actually, they are dumb under certain forms of societal organization. Perhaps not as a species. It's an important distinction there. Unless they can reform. And the most important reform for Vogt is to make them stop being so prolific. And he ended his career as the president of a large organization propagating contraception. No more children in India and elsewhere. Environment is born out of this profound reformationist zeal. Vogt's book is fantastic. You may or may not agree, but arguably it's fantastic. Arguably the first modern environmentalist text, going beyond the older conservationist literature that had been out there for more than a century, also with fantastic books by Henry David Thoreau, Aldo Leopold, and others, and strides ahead, actually, of Rachel Carson's earlier 1950 book, The Sea Around Us, which is not an environmentalist book at all, rather a book about the awe of nature, how grand it is, and how little we know about it. Wonderful book too, but for a different reason. Each of Vogt's 12 chapters addressed a problem: pollution, overfishing, erosion, poverty, and so on. environment was also that, a catalogue of problems. And the environment was the concept that could integrate all these phenomena under one label, which made it more than geography, more than ecology, more than medicine, more than economics, and so on. And when you follow the early years of environmental writing in the 1950s and 60s, this is one of the most striking features, the discovery that once the environment is there, it is so much you can use it for, a wonderfully elastic concept. Vogt used the word actually in passing. He doesn't elaborate on it. He doesn't start the first sentence with it. Somehow slips in. But once it started slipping in, it was spreading, and it turned out to be so useful because it described something that was emerging historically, namely the new human predicament affecting the planet on the large scale. Fairfield Osborne, another ecologist, talked of humans at about this, at actually the same year, 1948, of humans working on massive scale. Humanity, he says in this book, was a geological force. Have we heard it before? And soon the floodgates were open. In 1948, ICSU organized the first International Conservation Congress. At the same time, there was a congress focusing on future natural resources, because the war effort had discovered that these resources were of critical strategic importance for economies and for warfare. The concerns for nature multiplied and moved quickly into the core of Cold War priorities. Military powers, led by the United States and the USSR, supported massive environmental research. As they called it, they meant a little bit different than we do today. The attempt to secure survival of troops in extreme climates, such as the Arctic and the tropics. High-altitude physiology was used to prepare cockpits in jet fighters. Synthetic fibers were developed to keep cold and heat out. And if you read a little bit on this, you would see the word environment used in this particular context. This is from the Harvard Fatigue Laboratory archives in Boston. One of the most fascinating archives I've ever been to. The American military had large programs for environmental research long before the concept environmental sciences had even been coined, which was in 1959 by South Africa-born primatologist Solly Zuckerman, who had developed operational research during the war and was a well-known science policy advisor, and a founder of the British Natural Environment Research Council, NERC. And here you perhaps thought about it already. It's lots of experts here. It's expertise everywhere. And many of these speak very big. They are, we call them in this book, that some of my things I say here derive from this book here about the environment and the concept. We call them meta-expertise, meta-experts. And here is another one. Harrison Brown, a physicist, who wrote pessimistically in 1954 of the New World ridding itself of resources. He used the concept peak oil, and he was not the first to do that. It was dubbed already, also in 1948, actually, by the American geologist M. King Hubbert, then working for the oil company Shell, and also for the Materials Commission in the US. This whole line of thinking ultimately led to the limits of growth, the Club of Rome report in 1972, and its computer-based projections, very much about the future of resources. Also in 1948, Norbert Wiener published his book on cybernetics, suggesting connectivities that made steering more attainable, a first step towards the metaphor of the spaceship Earth, that the Earth was, and humanity on it, was possible to regulate like a missile. And precisely here is where another major feature comes in. It's also very important to understand the modern environment, namely that it can be translated into numbers. The old concept, nature, always had this narrative, perhaps also somewhat nostalgic character. Natural history was descriptive, catalogs of species, think about Linnaeus, parades of skeletons and animals in museums, you've seen that. The environment, as an object of study, quickly turned into something else, into a response mode. First, human action, then environmental response. If the environment changed as an effect of human agency, it was important to know how rapid this response was and how serious. So the environment became the study of human-induced change and the rate of this change. So quantification became essential, as did monitoring and continuous observation. If rates of change were high, the environment could also be perceived as having an urgent problem. Things were going quickly the wrong way. So one of the first products of the environment was actually the environmental problem. And Vogt's book, as we heard, was already full of them. They would soon be everywhere. There once was a town in the heart of America. The opening words of Silent Spring. A country standing at that point in time in 1962, as it seemed on the pinnacle of human achievement, richer and mightier than any other country in the world and in history. But people fell sick. Children out playing collapsed and died. And where were the birds? In the skies there was silence. Was it witchcraft? Was it a new strange enemy? No. It was chemical products bought by ordinary people to keep them healthy and their soil productive. The people had done it themselves. That was the insight, and it scared people possibly even more than it was that it was their own making. But strangely, the people who did this, they were not studied much. The bulk of environmental research was devoted to the environment itself. And what followed next was the future. If you knew the rates of change, it became an urgent matter to predict where that could lead us. If necessary, determine whether something dangerous might happen. So the future became gloomy. Alongside, it became gloomy precisely at the moment when precisely the opposite was often the case. No, so that was the wrong arrow. And this is actually by an artist by the name of Jim Powers from Ford Motor Company called Moonport, Life in the Year 2000. And that was where most of the expertise went, after all, to understanding how the environment changed, to model it, to observe it, determine what to do about it. The societies that produced the problems by their use of materials and the growth of their economies were peculiarly left out of the picture. And the experts in those fields themselves didn't pay too much attention either. They, for a long time, left it that way. Gradually, over the 1950s and early 1960s, this new language of anthropogenic environmental impact spread. A conference in Princeton in 1955 was a coalescing and important moment. The discussions there were broad. The scientists still didn't dominate totally among the 70 participants. There were a few others, social scientists, for example, social planners. There was one woman there, an Indian plant geneticist. Her name was Janaki Amal. 72 were men. Lewis Mumford, the urban historian, social planner and visionary, felt the need to liven up the meeting after a week of dismay messages and talked about love as the cure. He was perhaps heralding the psychedelic 60s, but perhaps also revealing with this little innocent remark the almost total void of intellectual energy that had yet gone into what was with time becoming the ultimate question. If the environment is headed for disaster, And if it is us, the people, that do it ourselves, why don't we find out more about ourselves so we can avoid doing it? And really, apart from contraception, Vogt's method, there was really not very much ideas around at the time. In a sense, you could say that the rest is history. This image, of course, is from the UN meeting in Stockholm in 1972. We've heard about Rachel Carson and other milestones. We can see the rise of various governance initiatives over the following decades, following the Stockholm Conference. It was a very significant, real and symbolical turning point, all the way up to, for example, this meeting, where spirits were fairly high about the climate agreement. And we also have here on the image the Sustainable Development Goals. In between these two pictures lie hundreds of conferences by the UN or others, hundreds of agreements and treaties, all in the name of the environment and its protection from ourselves. The integrative work that environment was capable of has continued. In the 1960s, the First Nations got their environmental agencies, which has also continued to spread. In 1965, the American president already then got an expert report suggesting that he should investigate measures to stop global warming. Lyndon Johnson took this very seriously, based on the little evidence there was. Things have changed. Writing a book on parts of this history, as we have done, entitled The Environment, A History of the Idea, with my co-authors here, Libby Robin at ANU and Paul Ward in Cambridge, has kept me busy for many years. In fact, our project on what we called first Expertise of the Future started in 2009 in Copenhagen and took us through a long string of workshops and write-shops on 4 continents. Our point of departure was the observation, visible from day one in 1948, as we have seen, up until the present, that the expertise is always present where there is environment. In a certain sense, it is the expertise that produces the environment. Often they also gain the right to talk about it and to argue on its behalf. And when we studied this history of expertise from this particular point of view, we realized that we also, in a sense, discovered a new history of science. So in the first stage of the project, we were so bogged down by everything that we discovered that we started to collect the documents that build somehow a kind of genealogy of the environment. And we call this The Future of Nature, which is the volume to the left. More than 500 pages with some 40 texts commented by current experts. Might even be 1 or 2 of you here in this room today. And then among these 40, the Planetary Boundaries paper in 2009 is the penultimate document. The very last is Mike Hume's article, Reducing the Future to Climate, published in 2011. So it runs all the way up to our present. In between lay texts by Vladimir Vernadsky, Alfred Lotka, Arthur Tansley, the ecologist, Rachel Carson, Linton Caldwell, and also some older names such as Malthus, von Humboldt, Alexander von Humboldt, von Karlowitz, and the more recent formulations of the modern environment by Alva Myrdal, leading the work towards an Institute for Future Studies in Stockholm in 1972, Gretchen Daly, Ecosystem Services, and in the 90s, Nick Stern on climate economies in the 2000s. Now, what is striking is how comprehensive the register was that the genealogy covered. Population issues, for example, this is in Swedish, but it's a good metaphor of the day back in the 50s and early 60s by George Borgström, a thinking head here. And other themes were measurement and quantification, biological diversity, progress of civilization, technology, of course. Climate is a special case and a case in its own right. It arrived late and was for a long time wrapped up in a veil of Cold War secrecy. It was a different kind of expertise, too, that sort of flocked around climate issues. It's very much linked to the Cold War. It was very much linked to security. And one of its remarkable features where climate science took place was this site here in northern Greenland, Camp Century, the subglacial missile park that didn't really work as the engineers had planned. It was a little nuclear power thing inside there too. But it made it possible for the scientists to work on the Greenland ice cores to verify climate change. So there was a good side effect of it. Now, the little trio of authors that you saw in the previous image had laid the foundation, and we could much better understand how revolutionary the change was that happened in the immediate post-war years when the environment was invented and human agency was articulated as the overwhelming force, not as something that might happen in some future, but was taking place in real time. A main message from our book here on the environment is that scales are essential. The environment starts big enough with major issues, but they were not precisely planetary in the beginning, and they were not fully systemic. After FACT, they scaled both downwards, down to the local polluted river or the factory chimney, and upwards towards the largest planetary scale. The Apollo photograph that we all have seen at Christmas 1968 is rightly heralded as a decisive moment, perhaps a turning point for humanity. But as we've seen, the environment was already there since a couple of decades. It was nothing new, really. That photograph helped it jump scales. But it is also the time scales and the temporalities that we encountered already with Brodel. How the rates of change make everything change as the environment enters the 21st century. And it does so with the concept Anthropocene, an old word actually, that comes back decisively. It had been around, as I said, for a long time. Here is one of the earliest proponents of something like that, an 18th century French philosopher, who actually also managed the Royal Gardens in Paris. He was a very busy guy, and he wrote close to 100 books and was constantly on the move and made experiments on his big, super big farm in Burgundy, and was a big winemaker too, actually. Vernadsky and others that I mentioned proposed this concept. Of course, famously also, he proposed this idea of the biosphere. But not until the relaunch by geochemist Paul Crutzen and several other scientists in the Earth system science community in the early years of the 2000s, it really took off forcefully. And a key moment was in 2005 at a Dahlem conference in Berlin. Several Earth system scientists gathered together with archaeologists and historians and tried to put together the state-of-the-art knowledge of long-term changes. And the result was this graph on the right-hand side called the Great Acceleration. Around that time was when the very concept itself was coined. And it was inspired. You all understand this, so I don't need to explain it to you. But it was inspired, perhaps less well known, by Karl Polanyi's concept, the Great Transformation. This political theorist in 1944 published this book. And its main idea, it's that change doesn't come in bits and pieces. It is sometimes more than that. It can be pervasive and sweeping. He wanted to explain how the modern time has come about, so to speak, in the 1600s and 1700s and 1800s. How it links across sectors, across political boundaries, across technologies, resources, energies. It involves economics and ideas at the same time. It remakes the legal structures. And over a period of a couple of hundred years, an institutional and moral frame is built around capitalist society that dictates behavior and ideas of progress and success that by and large did not, and that is perhaps the main point here, it did not consider environment or sustainability because these ideas didn't exist. So the modern world was created around something that was before environment and sustainability. So when the idea of the environment finally arrived after the Second World War, it was, of course, potentially disruptive, a seed of thought that might, one of those days, bring the old modernity out of joint and usher in a new great transformation that can overturn and change the human-Earth relationship with, to paraphrase the Bible, new laws, new morals, new economics, and the new ideas of good and evil. The Great Acceleration was a similar idea on the same grand scale, with the additional element of the natural sciences offering much of the evidence. That was not the case so much with Polanyi's work. Change also now occurs in the environment. It happens in the seas. That is what these graphs give us, in forests and fields, along with the growth of digital technologies, stock markets, welfare budgets, demographic shifts, long life expectancies, an exponential growth in university degrees, calories of meat, energy consumption, and so on. And only a few years after the Dahlem meeting in 2009, really the same community of Earth system scientists could launch another idea, namely that some of these hockey stick curves are very dangerous. They risk to disturb the stability domain of the Holocene. The entire time period since the latest ice age, 11,700 years ago. And if these boundaries were crossed, runaway change would follow and nobody would know the consequences. And when I say this, I'm pointing right at the heart of SEI. It is inevitable not to see this new turn as a response to all this massive change in Earth systems thinking and the coupled crises in the late years of the previous century, particularly the financial crisis. This all started around 2009, 2010. In retrospect, one can also see that Dipesh Chakrabarty's article in Critical Inquiry, A Climate for History, spurred this discussion. So here is yet another historian coming back into the picture. He was very much inspired by the climate change discourse, an extremely influential paper. And when I was first invited to his seminar in the Franke Institute at the University of Chicago in March 2012, I didn't know that, but in the audience was a journalist writing for Forbes magazine. I gave a paper about the history of climate science focusing on Scandinavian meteorologists and glaciologists, precisely those that Astrid was talking about earlier, working in Stockholm University. And when I returned to Stockholm a day or two later, I found my name all over the web. 2 articles were published in Forbes drawn from my talk. I was slightly scared. I had talked about the importance of narrative, and that was cited in Forbes. Actually, how the new orthodoxy of anthropogenic climate change was, of course, about scientific knowledge, but also about how the story was framed. That had not been working out when Arrhenius presented his idea of CO2 warming in the 1890s, or when Guy Stewart Callender, the British steam engineer in 1938, was brushed aside after a paper where he had everything right. They had no narrative. In the 1950s and 1960s, that humans changed the climate of burning fossil fuels could be aligned with the environment. And from 2005, it could be aligned with the Great Acceleration. 2 big narrative frames. And then it reached almost biblical proportion. And it was still just as in Silent Spring, the people did it themselves, only on a bigger scale. And let me finally turn our attention back to Stockholm, the greenest city in the world. And let me do that through the name of Carl Gustav Rossby, who was one of those people here in Stockholm who realized this. A Latin student born in Gotland who became one of Sweden's most important scientists in the previous century. He went to the US in 1925 with a letter of recommendation from Arrhenius. And he was also advisor to Charles David Keeling during the International Geophysical Year in 57-58, as he was looking for the site to set up his famous measuring instrument to monitor atmospheric CO2. And he also worked on the Princeton computer, together with these people, for example. And he worked also on the BESC computer from KTH in the neighboring building, in Drottninggatan 95A, where the first numerical weather forecast was completed in June 1955. An early proponent of the CO2 hypothesis, and just like Greta Thunberg, as we could see on the cover of Time magazine. And saying these words, which reveal how the environment story starts to align with the climate change story, these words talking about respect for the planet on which we live. So these stories had started to align with climate change. And perhaps the most important thing he did was that he supervised this man, Bert Bolin, who became the founding president of IPCC and also involved in the founding of this journal in 1972, with also Crutzen involved, again, with many links to Stockholm. And one of the directors of the IGBP that we heard mentioned before, Will Steffen, was also one of the leaders in the forming of the Earth System Science community and prominent in forming the Planetary Boundaries paper. Then SEI was already up and running, and the hosting institution. And with Stockholm as a base, it's also very easy to link this to the research program I just started with a grant from the European Research Council called SPHERE. By now, we have learned enough about the environment to be able to answer, I think, the fundamental question at the beginning: where did it come from? And I think we can see now that it wasn't always there. It was somehow produced over a long period of time by a range of voices coming from many different fields. And let me turn to my final slide by skipping over a few here. And look at this. But I think we can summarize what I've said here in a set of phases of the environment from 1948 up until the 2020s that we are facing now. And if the first phase, from 1948 to 1972 in the UN conference, was about conceptualization and integration, we could see how the next phase was very much about institutionalization and consolidation. Government departments and institutes being formed, ministers and so on. And since the Rio meeting, we have had a period of pluralization with lots of competing concepts and varieties where environment is not always the main concept at hand. So what is coming next? We don't know, of course, nobody knows. But I think that it might be worth the while thinking about this as a period of increased transformation. And if there is some take-home message from the period after the Second World War and up until now, it's the importance of precisely narratives, of frames of thought and frames of thinking that can lead our way. When climate met environment and a new narrative appeared, and I think that is what we need for the future as well. But how it will play out, maybe the panel discussion can shed some light on that. So in the spirit of Gordon Goodman, I wish SEI the best of luck in contributing to that next decade of work, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sverker, for this fascinating exposé. I think it's indeed useful to reflect on the greater time frames of which we are only a little dot in the long exposé here. I'd like to hand over a humble gift from the Institute for as a thank you for your lecture and your words. Speaking of new social narratives for the future, I think it combines at least 4 sustainable development goals. Oh. Food, health, climate, natural resources, and industry. Well, that's 5 actually. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now we will have a short coffee break. We will proceed down to the basement where KSLA traditionally serves its coffee and tea. And we will reconvene here at 10 to, roughly, 10 to 4. So thank you again, Sir.
Thank you.
Just. Är det ett nytt projekt? Ja, det är det. Ja, grattis.
Jaha, inte mindre än 5 utvecklingsmål här. Det måste vara
Ja.
So a physicist listening to a historian talk about the environment. That was quite something to... I hadn't appreciated that publication in the American in that period.
Yeah. Well, the word is over, but this particular word usage of it sounds like totally wasn't reversing. It used to be affecting.
And there was one thing, the reason I came up to ask was that what you said, there was a quote which you started talking about the
Yeah, the other way around. Stop.
So who was that? Okay, and that is that was recorded.
Yeah, that was what it says.
That's the emergence of music.
Yeah, well, that's the re-emergence rather, but yes, that's the spurring moment of this new phrase. This decade has been
Yeah.
so I see this.
So sort of key central moments.
Yeah, key central.
Fascinating.
Jag tänkte du skulle säga Linköping inte intresserade.
fast också visat mig att det är inte annat. Ja, det är de som är registrerade. Är det många namnlappar?
Det är nästan lite läskigt. Det är så här, jag var där förra hösten. Det var nästan att vi blir så snälla och lyfta lite. Det är spännande liksom att alla stora fåglar ökar. Tranor och rödfågel var ju bra för oss. Det var ju taskigt på många småfåglar. Jag tror att gäss och tranor ökar. Det beror ju mest på att omläggning av jordbruket. Mat, kanske så och så vidare. Gässen älskar ju stopp. Och det har ju varit lite i senaste 20 år. Det är ju som en restaurang. Och sen så också till jakt. Fast nu börjar man ha skyddsjakt på gäss i Danmark och visst mål i Sverige också. Enda fungerande strategi. Jo, det känns inte så dåligt att gå in och polemisera. Nej, man kan polemisera väldigt. Det tror jag är det bästa, effektivaste. Vänlig polemik tror jag. Det effektivaste. Polletten trillar inte ner då. Nej, precis. Ja, precis. Ja, vad gör du annars om du inte... Jag vandrar omkring i tillvaron. Jaha, okej. Hur känns det då? För mig känns det helt okej. Jag gillar att liksom dela mig inom olika områden. Ja, precis. Jag tycker det är kul att gå på sånt här. Ja, jag med.
It's one of those days that we've got to get back to work. So. But okay, yeah, I'll let you know. Yes. Hello. Yeah, of course.
Okay. The very well-behaved class here today. Yes, very nice. So I will not take up any time here. I will just simply have the honor and pleasure to introduce our next moderator, Dr. Somya Joshi, who's been with SCI for a half year now. So she's one of our very most recent additions to the senior researchers at SCI here in Stockholm. So warmly welcome again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Måns. I will start by introducing our panelists today. To Sverker, you need no introduction. You've already heard a fantastic lecture earlier today, and I will introduce one by one my colleagues here. I start with Rebecka. Rebecka is a conservation biologist. She's worked as an environmental consultant and also as an activist. Rebecka, since the last election, is a member of the parliament, especially of the Swedish Green Party, and she's a spokesperson for biodiversity. So she brings that expertise and lens to the panel. We then move to Fiona, who's a colleague of mine, Fiona Lambe at Stockholm Environment Institute. Fiona is a research fellow, and her work so far has focused on behavior and change. Specifically, she has a background in innovative methods and approaches for understanding behavioral change over time. What is very interesting is that her fieldwork has taken her to diverse developing world contexts ranging from Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, India, Cambodia, Colombia, and Nepal. So that's hopefully also the lens Fiona will be bringing to this discussion. From there we move on to Olle Torpman, who is a philosopher. He has a PhD in practical philosophy from Stockholm University. His focus is on environmental ethics, and he's currently working as a researcher at the Institute for Future Studies, investigating ethical aspects of population policies. He also looks at animal ethics at SLU in Uppsala. So Olle will hopefully also bring to this panel discussion the lens on the ethical and moral issues of value. And finally, on the panel, we have Anders Wijkman, who is both an opinion maker and an author. He is the chairman of the governing board of Climate-KIC, the largest public-private partnership on innovation for low-carbon solutions in the EU. He is the honorary president of the Club of Rome, chairman of the advisory committee on the Swedish Climate Research Program. He's member of the board at SIDA, and also has served as a member of the EU Parliament and the Swedish Parliament, and has been an Assistant Secretary General of the UN and a Policy Director at UNDP. So I'm hoping Anders will also bring to this amazing panel a lens of policy and from his parliamentarian experience help us understand some of the concepts that we're trying to unpack. So with that brief introduction of all the panelists, what I was hoping we'd start with is just a quick round of reflections on what you heard during Sverker's lecture today. Maybe we start with Rebecka.
Yeah, is this on? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm very happy to be here today and to talk about environment. I have one reflection about when we stopped seeing nature and environment as something local linked to geography, and then from the picture of NASA that NASA took on the Earth. From that point, kinda, we have been seeing the environment as something global, and I think that. From this point, we have also lost a little bit of the connection to environment and nature and the nature question that is local, actually. And by that, from that point of view, we also start to think about environment as something that we will solve in a global, from a global view. And I think that is also a little bit risky, because we have been talking about climate and how to deal with climate from a global point of view. We will start to trade with carbon dioxide and talk about tons, and we kind of lose the feeling for nature. And that is something I want to bring back to the discussion when we talk about environment, to bring it back to also include the local nature.
Thank you. Maybe when all the panelists have had a chance to add their reflections, Sverker, you would like to respond to that. Fiona, would you like to go next?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for a brilliant talk. I even read your book, almost every single word. I really enjoyed it, and I learned a lot. And as I said to you just now on the coffee break, it inspired me to dig into a whole new literature. So I have a whole new reading list with me leaving today. I think the book touches on, as you said, different types of expertise that developed over the years, layers and layers developing over time as various schools interacted, and as they interacted in response to what was going on in the world as well, as the concept of environment emerged. And I kind of wanted to come back to this idea of expertise that were part of this process. And you mentioned the book touches on this here and there, that, for example, women weren't always present in these meetings and in these discussions, but also perhaps the absence of non-traditional academic expertise, including non-Western indigenous knowledge, for example, and how now, in the era of the Anthropocene, that we see efforts underway all over the world to try to get this inclusive localism back into the process at every level. But I'm wondering how this can be done. So it's a bit cheeky to get a question in this early, maybe, but as a historian of the environment, with your perspective on history and how these concepts and disciplines have so far developed, and how knowledge emerges and crystallizes, and how long this whole process can take. I'm a little bit curious about if and how other types of expertise can find their way into the history going forward. How they can break into the scientific establishment somehow. If they can ever really catch up, given that they've been locked out for such a long time. And should they even try to? Or are they likely to make more progress existing and interacting outside of the establishment?
Great, thank you, Fiona. Olle?
Yes, thank you very much for an interesting lecture, and thanks for inviting me. I think that the most interesting thing when it comes to discussions about the environment is the problems that we're dealing with now regarding the environment. And also I think it's very interesting that we have so much information and so much knowledge about the environmental situation. And we also have agreed upon different targets like the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. But still we're having such trouble to do something about it. And I think the reason is an ethical one, namely that we're endorsing different kinds of values. And these values, they allow for different sorts of measures or actions taken in order to get to the goals that we have settled. And I think, I mean, you're touching upon this, and it's involved in the book as well. I only managed to read half of it so far. But I think this is not so much of a question, but rather like a reflection. I think we would need, in society in general, more of this discussion about what are the core values that we're trying to safeguard here. What are the main reasons for reaching the 1.5 degree Celsius target? And also, like you touched upon, questions regarding the value of the environment or nature. I mean, we all want biodiversity to some extent, but is biodiversity valuable in itself, or is it only valuable as a means or as a resource for human purposes? And yeah, I think that's my reflection.
Great, thank you very much. And finally, Anders, would you like to share?
Okay.
Thank you very much. It's fascinating with these Gordon Goodman Memorial Lectures. They always attract the best speakers. And Sverker, this was a fascinating essay or expose. And I was struck by one sentence in your lecture. You said the modern world emerged before environment was a concept. And I think this is profoundly important. It explains, to a large extent, the resistance we have seen over the years when it comes to environment legislation and to take action. Because our perceptions have not really factored in environment until very recently. It explains why not all, but many economists have had such difficulties to integrate the environmental perspective. Although we know intuitively that the natural systems are our life-supporting systems. But the economy is built not aligned with those natural systems. It's built on top of these systems. And nature is looked upon more or less as a constant. And that may have worked 50, 100 years ago, when the world was relatively empty. We were 2, 3 billion people. And that's when modern economics developed. Now we are soon to be 8 billion people. And I think it's utterly naive to think that we can be guided by the same economic policy frameworks. Utterly naive. And to believe that market systems, as they are now organized, will do the trick. So I think that particular sentence, I think you should travel around the world and really explain that. One of the problems is, of course, that society is silo-based or vertically organized. And we see it in science and education. Most scientists talk in favor or speak in favor of interdisciplinarity and cooperation across disciplines, but at the end of the day, we have these vertical structures. And how knowledge is generated is, of course, very much a result of those vertical structures. I'm not saying we don't need specialists, but we also need people who understand better how things are interlinked. And things are interlinked. And the fact is, as you indicated, that environment has been mainly the domain of natural scientists. Both economists but also behavioral scientists have not really been involved. And I remember being invited to some organization of psychologists a few years ago. And that was the first meeting they had had about climate change and how to communicate climate change so that people can receive the message in an appropriate way. Because our brains are framed in a way that we have a tendency to not accept certain types of information. So I wonder if we had involved behavioral scientists earlier on, what it would have been. One of the things that have really struck me when it comes to the economy and climate system, ecosystems, is that the economy is basically a linear model, whereas these systems are non-linear. And it was accentuated last year when the Economics Prize Committee in the Royal Academy of Sciences selected Nordhaus as the Economics Prize winner. By the way, if you have time, visit OECD's website. There was a fascinating conference a few days ago. And the theme was Averting Systems Collapse. And Steve Keen makes a speech about conventional economics. He's an economist himself. And if I were the prize committee, I would go and hang myself. Because it's such a brilliant dismissal of his assumptions. So, I mean, this is non-linearity versus linearity. It's a major issue.
Perhaps
finally,
yeah.
The whole issue of externalities, and most of them not reflected in market prices. And at the same time, an economic system where you have a tendency to maximize your profits in the short term. And if you do that in a system where market prices are flawed, you will end up in a very bad situation. So, Sverker, my question is, how the hell do we create a better system when it comes to knowledge creation? And how do we bridge economy and ecology? They originate from the same concept, eco, to manage resources well. But the way ecologists and economists deal with this are very different. And we could take as an example the SDGs, 17 goals. If we go about to try to meet them one by one, we are not going to succeed. We need an integrated approach. And how do we make that happen?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for some very nice discussion points. I would let Sverker first respond to these questions or comments, and then we can go once again through the different topics raised here. Yeah.
Yeah, I should try and be brief, and it's so many things said that I can only touch on a few. And thanks very much for having listened carefully. Well, first of all, I must say, Rebecca. Yes, I think it's a very important point you make, that we have been talking lots about climate in recent years. We've been talking a little bit more about the sort of upper scale phenomena, and there's a tendency that those things that we were talking about some decades ago, about small places and environment there, was a little bit disregarded for some time. And I think the danger of that is, or some of it is because of success. Actually, some of those problems have been dealt with. But the good thing with that, and the good thing with another thing I didn't actually say about the concept of environment, is that it's elastic enough also to appeal to everybody, even at the smallest scale. Whereas some of the more recent concepts like Anthropocene and even climate somehow tends to be a bit further up, and many people are a bit alienated. That's why I think your point is very important. Well, Yes, if I may boil your interesting message down to this question of non-Western people, wherever they are, and also groups within Western societies that are less favored and heard less. It is really a challenge, because since this field of the environment was always so extremely expertise-laden, so to speak, it has been particularly also hard to get at for many people. Not everybody has felt included, and that is a policy danger in a sense, because that's when you get Gilets jaunes and other movements that wearing different clothes and protesting even against rising fuel prices and so on. So the legitimacy of the whole operation is very important. Certainly there is a big literature on this now, so we are not out of knowledge, but we should stress it more. Yes, ethics, to articulate the reasons and the value of things, absolutely. Although, of course, that's when you run into problems, because we tend to value things differently. And it's hard to create alignment. I think one of the strengths of the SDGs is, of course, that it has been able at some point, to at least some level, to get a unison agreement on those, and that's an achievement. But if you scratch their surface, as Anders likes to do, you find that there are many problems hidden under the carpet. My favorite book, to actually add to the list of readings to do, is by Mike Hume in 2009, right before the COP meeting in Copenhagen. He published a book entitled Why We Disagree About Climate Change. If you're reading only one book from this century, I'd say this is the book to read. It is because he explains why disagreement is not about what you disagree on, so to speak. In this case, whether you should believe or not believe in climate change. The deeper reasons for that is your deeper convictions about totally different things. For example, religion, your view on freedom, personal freedom, on consumption, on development, on these fundamental things. And I think it's fantastic work that is being done now, precisely by psychologists, about how these are interlinked. Actually, certain affections for this, A, B, and C, link to X, Z, and Y, and how this can actually be detected. I just met with a young psychologist at Stockholm University working on these kinds of things, and I must say I'm very hopeful that that will give some results. And now, you said many things, Anders, that are very important. And about your question, well, let me pick up on the communications that you talked about. I think that is another thing that right now I'm thinking quite a bit about how we can think in new ways about raising knowledge in society. I think you have heard the word bildning in Swedish, or Bildung in German. That was actually used to be much in the past as cherished value, but somehow it's now shrinking down. I think that is particularly a problem in a period like we have now, when with much forces in society really pulling off in the wrong direction. And so I would really encourage the knowledge maintaining institutions, both the school systems and and not least the universities and the media, to collaborate on race and to use their pretty large resources to communicate more intensely with society at large. I think that is extremely important. But exactly how we create a better system, as your super big question, I think maybe I should return to that maybe later, because I've already used a few minutes here, and I would like more people to be able to speak.
Sure.
Thanks.
One of the things I wanted to pick up on from your talk today, Sverker, is this: you talked about a shift in focus, both historically, when you look at how the environment was a backdrop against which human action was observed, to now where we talk about things like the Anthropocene, where we are in the forefront, and the environment is, how we look at the relationship between what we do and how it impacts the environment. The other shift you mentioned was about this focus or obsession with monitoring, evaluating, looking at rate of change, and then somehow we're silent about how that change came to be, or what society caused it, or who caused it, or where the accountability is. So these were two sort of interesting shifts that your talk touched upon, and I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more, and then the panelists could come in from their own specific lenses and add to that.
Yeah, let me start with a second thing then about can you say that again, that you said the last point?
So the shift between the sort of measuring, monitoring one.
The measuring. I certainly have nothing against that. I mean, that is really why we have this enormous knowledge about the environment. And in a certain sense, we have created the environment through the measuring, through the observation. And we have, take the biosphere, for example. You need the sort of the idea that there is a biosphere there. And then you start investigating it. And when you investigate, you find out, oh, that's very important. Things happen just at the interface of heaven and earth, so to speak. Precisely that 2 meters where we are walking around as human beings. And we are part of it. And when you start building that idea, it becomes extremely important. All of a sudden, you have the biosphere program on the global level. And that's necessary. And then you have an international geosphere, biosphere program. You combine that. And that is leading over to this enormous shift of understanding that we have now. So these things tend to happen all the time. That's why this is certainly a very important shift. That's why. And I don't think that this stands in any tension really to you need to do that. But when I said also that the people were disregarded, it was because that was too one-sided. I think we have used basically half a century, to put it pretty crudely, to study the environment and understanding how it works, and we're pretty good at that. But we have not put the same energy into thinking about the other side, namely the causes of it. And that's, of course, where it links, particularly to Anders' comment here, that we need to know more about the drivers in society. And I think we've been a bit too shy there. I think we need to call, as we say in Swedish, a spade for a spade. we need to understand that this is very much, and I think Anders said it also, it's very much linked to the economic system. Exactly. And we need to question it, basically. I don't think there's another way out. We did invent smart ideas since the 1980s up until very recently, maybe up until the crisis in 2008 and 9, that are commonly called neoliberal approaches. In that toolbox, there are many interesting tools. And I've been pretty fond of some of them. And I think still some are quite useful. And we dreamt about green growth coming out of that. I think there is a limit to green growth. There's a limit to what that toolbox can do. I think we must question things much more fundamentally, and that's probably the answer also to Anders' question. So that was what I meant with the shift, and now I have elaborated on them.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I think measurements and metrics are, of course, very, very important, because we have to benchmark, we have to see where we are going. And one of the things that really is perplexing and very, very challenging is the fact that already in 1987, when the Brundtland report was launched, the main theme in that report, the conclusion was we have to decouple conventional growth from energy and material use. And we saw some slight decoupling at the global level in the 1990s, and I think it was very much the effect of the collapse of the Soviet system, because their growth went down by 20, 30, 40% in many of the countries. Unfortunately, for the last 10 to 15 years, the world is not decoupling, it's recoupling. The growth in energy and materials is growing faster, the demand, than the growth of the economy. And it's primarily the result of emerging economies investing in infrastructure, where you need steel, cement, plastics, aluminium. And these basic materials are very carbon generating. Not only that they need energy in the process, but they need fossil energy to produce. I mean, you need coke and coal to produce steel. Plastics are made out of oil and gas, etc. So this to me, and that's And there I go back to 1972 and the Limits to Growth report. And I was for many years co-chairman of the Club of Rome, so I've followed this debate. And economists basically said at the time, this report is rubbish, because if there is scarcity, if there is pollution, we will find new technologies. We will substitute. And you can, of course, substitute many things, but you cannot substitute a stable climate. You cannot substitute biodiversity, clean water, soil.
Mm-hmm.
So in my opinion, and we now see 50 years later, we have not solved it through technology and innovation. That's not to say that we shouldn't put money in technology and innovation, but we have to change the system.
Exactly. Rebecka, would you like to come in there, and then Fiona?
Yeah. I think that the thing that we are lacking is not knowledge. Of course, we have to monitor nature and environment, but the thing that is lacking right now is acting on it. And I totally agree with Anders that the economic system has to be questioned. And what you said also, that we have been knowing this stuff for a really long time. 20 years ago, we set up the national environmental goals in Sweden, and we haven't really reached them yet. 1.5 we have reached, but that's not...
Out of 16.
Out of 16, so that's a really disaster. And that means, from my perspective, it's not so surprising though, because we have been putting all of these global goals and national environmental goals aside from the rest of the society. We do not really incorporate them in our companies, in our different organizations. We leave them to people and to NGOs to work with them from goodwill. And that's not enough. And we have to incorporate it in the economy, of course. And I too think that it's naive to think that we could just move on in the same direction that we do. And what I think is lacking is actually the debate about values. Because while we're putting all these global goals on the table, there will always be an underlying value that is actually dominating, and that is the economic growth. That is actually one of the global goals. It's named after economic growth. As long as we don't shift and have a debate and actually rethinking our values, I don't think that we can actually fix any problems. And one of these value things is, as you mentioned, how do we look upon other species? Is it up to us to just preserve the ones that is giving us these ecosystem services, or should we actually try to extend the circle of empathy and solidarity to other species? I think it's time to really question if we, as human beings, are just here to dominate every other species and all the other ecosystems on this earth, or if we want to shift. And that biggest challenge is in our heads, I think.
Thank you. I think what would be really nice is to pick up on that point about how we assign value in terms of either nature-based solutions or ecosystem services, and how we achieve that gear shift. But before we go to that, I'd like Fiona to sort of step in and tell us a bit about her work on this designing for behavioral change.
I wasn't going to
Sure.
talk about that,
yeah.
no, but I wanted to pick up on this, you know, that it's time to have this debate, it's time to see something happening and question, are we seeing that now? With what's happening with Greta and the global youth movement, and this coming up again and again like it never has before, to the point where it's starting to trigger individuals to fundamentally change their behavior here in Sweden and all across the world. So I think it would be interesting, I've started to try and put this in a historical perspective now, and I wonder, is this just a blip of a social movement, or is it something that will trigger and lead to something much bigger? Is it a tipping point? And it gives me hope as well. I think perhaps I don't have an answer to the big economic question, and yes, we need a system change, but I tend to be very practical, and my work is very much local, on the ground kind of stuff, and I see things happening all over the world. Things are happening, but they're not being talked about in the bigger meetings, perhaps. So I think we talked a little bit about the importance of narratives. Yes, quantitative measures are important, keeping track of the numbers is really important, but it's really crucial that that is translated and packaged in a good way, not dumbed down, but packaged and communicated in a way that grabs the imagination. And I believe that's what's happening now, actually. I think. I'm not a historian, though, so I don't have the same perspective. So I think I just wanted to shift up the hope part a bit.
And Olle, you want to come in on the more...
Yeah, I think that, I mean, we need change on so many, at so many levels in society. And the reason why it's so hard to make that change come true is I think that some people are against that change. And why are they against that change? Well, then we come to the value thing again, I assume. And what are we supposed to do then? Of course, we can force people just to be part of a change that they don't want to be part of. But I don't think that's the way to go. Then we can use the narratives about the environment in which we live and so on, and we can. But I want to come back to this. I think we need to see that the underlying causes here are the value system that people endorses, and try to first of all start questioning these and investigating these different value systems, and that's what the ethical study is all about. And second, also we can actually start investigating what reasons are there from these conservative or neoliberal libertarian perspectives. What reason are there from these perspectives that are usually taken as a ground for not doing anything about climate change or environmental degradation? What reasons are there from these kinds of perspectives to actually do something about it? And there are such reasons, but the problem, I think, is that we don't point to these reasons. We point to the reasons that the people like us here endorse, but not the reasons or the values that our enemies endorse.
Yeah?
There is an American sociologist, Arlene Hochschild. She's married to a famous historian, Adam Hochschild. And she wrote a book a couple of years ago. I don't remember the title now, but she moved down to Tennessee and settled down for a couple of years, and she started to interview people in Tennessee. It's the next to worst polluted state in the US, a lot of chemical industry. And it's the birthplace of the so-called Tea Party movement. And she says in the preface in the book, I wanted to understand how these people think and how they reason. And what came out was fascinating. Of course, they are very religious, and any politician who doesn't subscribe to sort of the Bible, etc., is out. Secondly, they do not trust government, not at the federal level, state level, local level. They are suspicious about government. Third, they hate taxes, even if they benefit from social support through the tax system. And fourth, they think the industry should not be regulated, because regulation is always bureaucratic. So even people she interviewed who had contracted cancer and other diseases by working in that environment, they were against legislation. And it was sort of an eye-opener that the worldview was so totally different from the one we have. And it was ordinary people. And there was nothing sinister about them. They were just having a totally different worldview. Mm-hmm. It has to do with education, it has to do with religion, it has to do with culture, etc. So I think when we talk about values, we also have to realize that values are seen in different perspectives by different people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for that. And on the topic of behavioral change, I think it would be really good to hear your thoughts there before we move on more to the sort of subject of how we construct this new narrative that Sverker spoke about. And then I would like to leave some time also for audience questions. So, yeah, Fiona.
Yeah, I guess once again, I'm often thinking on the local and individual level. And I think the literature is showing this, the literature on consumption at the individual level has shown that basically there's a whole literature talking about hard top-down measures to change individual behavior, bottom-up measures, and I think the final consensus is it's something in the middle. We need a combination of both. I so I can talk more about behavior, but I wanted to pick up on what my colleagues here were saying about values, because I think it's definitely tricky. And how do you? My follow-up question would be then on what you said, Olle, and on this anthropologist, it sounds like, who did this excellent study in Tennessee. What do you do then? So you understand, okay, because I really struggle with this too. I try to put myself in other people's shoes, and that's been a sort of fundamental element of all the work that I've done on the ground. And then it's really, depending on the project I've been in, you have to decide, what do I do with this information? What, you know, and sometimes it's more straightforward, but this is really tricky. How do you change values? And how do we change social norms? And how do we do it quickly enough to address the urgency of the issues that we're facing? And all I have, unfortunately, is like a boring researcher answer to that. That yeah, it's a combination of top down and bottom up. And
but
yes,
it is.
But it's how do we? Where do we go next, and how do we scale that up?
We at least needs to start debating them. Or discussing them, rather than discussing, should one eat meat or not? Should one fly or not? Should one have kids or not? Should one? Well, I mean, what's the underlying reasons for doing this or that? What's the underlying value? And that we seldom discuss that. So that's one. I mean, it won't. The ethical part is just one small piece in the puzzle, so it won't solve the entire problem. But
Rebecca, sorry, you wanted to come in there?
I just want to mention a global movement that is ongoing right now, which is rights of nature, which I think is a way of changing and shifting the way of seeing on nature. So this is by legislating, how do you say? It's a way to design the laws to make nature having rights as a person, and then to I mean, how do we change the values? I think it's also like both of it. Everything is needed. But if we do legislation like this, we will also shift how we are thinking and seeing on the world, on the nature. What if a flood, or what if an ecosystem had legal rights that could be defended?
Sverker wanted to come in here just briefly, and then we go to that.
Yeah, so this thing on whether when we change here, at least partially, is it just a blip on the curve? And so far, we can say yes, it has just been a blip on curves. The things almost all the curves are sort of pointing upwards when it comes to consumption of various materials and energy and so on. I don't think that is a reason not to keep going. That is, sometimes from the political level we hear that Sweden has this ambition to be sort of a vanguard country, to sort of go before the rest. And I think that is actually a quite important idea that should even be elaborated even more. Because I think that those people that you encounter when you go to Tennessee, like in this fascinating and horrifying story, is that if you look over the long term, historically, everybody will change. But people don't change because you tell them to change. They change in ways that they are not aware of themselves, in a sense. We all do. But it takes time. And people tend to go to behaviors and live in ways that actually improve things for them, make it better. So I think the challenge here is to demonstrate that what we are doing, for example here, can be actually a template that can demonstrate that this is even better. It is not anything that will change the world very quickly, but it is something that is also, I think, ethically necessary to do. There is empirical work ongoing with people who want to lead better lives from the climate perspective, but have a hard time doing it. And it's a very interesting group. Many in this room probably belong to it, that we actually would like to push ourselves down to maybe 2 tons per year. where the average Sweden is now 11. And those who try, in Storuman, for example, Björn Ferry and his team, and his wife and his entire family, they try very hard. They've gone down to 7. And they say, if we don't pitch tents 365 days per year in the forest, and that's not very easy in Storuman, I can tell you, in January. We won't be able to make it. So but you need to do that personal effort in order to make the political system respond and say, actually, yes, we will take more collective responsibility. If you don't do anything, you're probably not going to see much political action either. So it's this interaction. And I would like to see that sort of interaction between the policy level and the sort of structural levels and the individual and civic level as a kind of a super big societal project that could even be, so to speak, politicized, to be created and brought forward as a political idea. And but we have to be able to demonstrate that this is not leading a super bad life. It's actually going to be a good life too. Yeah.
When we developed the climate strategy for Sweden, that then became climate law, I think that was the strongest unifying factor among the political parties, that we should be seen as an example, that we should demonstrate, because we have such enormous preconditions to do that. Secondly, to just illustrate that it's both top-down and bottom-up in almost every aspect. Look at fast electronics or fast fashion. The business models are built on the assumption that we will change this every 18 months, and that we will buy new clothing every 3rd or 4th month, even more frequently. As long as we accept that and continue to sort of pursue that as consumers, this is going to be fine. And H&M, by the way, they had sold a little bit better the last couple of months, and now the value of the stock went up 7% today. But from an environmental point of view, that increase in sales with the present sort of configuration is, of course, very, very negative. So unless we have sort of a dialogue between production and consumption, how to design business models, and this goes far beyond fashion and electronics, but fashion and electronics are so visible, we are not going anywhere, because individuals cannot change the system alone. Groups of people can change the system, but they have also to have a dialogue with those who rule the game. So it's so complex, and it's not top-down or bottom-up, it's both.
Yes, exactly, and that sort of talks also to what Sverker mentioned in his lecture about scales, whether these are systemic, whether it's the local level, whether it's global. A lot of what we have just discussed now at the panel, you hear this dichotomy often presented that, is it the individual who should change their consumption habits, maybe fly less, or how they buy clothes or their electronic gadgets? Or is it the heavy industry, the polluting industries, like whether it's the steel, cement, or is it governments? And where does this onus lie? And secondly, what you touched upon as well, Fiona, is the context of developing world and this very much focus of what we can achieve here in Sweden, given all the privileges that we have here. Maybe keeping that lens of scales, could we have a sort of final discussion here before we open up to the audience for questions on what kind of new narratives could be designed, within this scale for transformation? Would you like to go first, or maybe Olle? Yeah.
I think the question is: it the individual who is responsible to make the change, or the institutions, the collectives? I think that question is, you're right, that's a question we're asking, but why not both? As individuals, we have certain opportunities and options that we can choose. That might not solve the world's problems, of course, but they will make some difference, and they will also influence the institutional levels to be more capable of conducting their solutions. So I think it's the answer to that question is both. Of course, there are different options to individuals and collectives, but
maybe different impacts as well.
Yes, exactly.
So Rebecca, you wanted to ask?
Yeah, I totally agree, but I also want to highlight that the more power you have, the more responsibility you have also. But if you're not in that position, you have to start wherever you can, and that is like, of course, doing the best you can with your choices. But we should not look away from the from the big industries and from the economy and the big questions here. That's just also important to not to forget.
Yeah, I fully agree about that. Just because everyone has some sort of responsibility, don't mean that that responsibility is equal. I mean, it depends on the options, the opportunities, the capabilities that you have.
Fiona?
Yeah, I read a really interesting sort of pop science piece recently, a behavioral science piece that talked about just this: how do you influence individual behavior change for climate mitigation? And there was a nice quote that for so long we've been looking for a silver bullet. We've been looking for the one thing that's going to change everything and catalyze something. But it's actually it's a silver bookshot. It's a sort of silver scattershot that we're looking for. And I think we have plenty of examples. I have many at the top of my head on the ground of things that are starting to happen. We need good examples of where we start to see norms shifting, where these different levels are coming together. And I can see a lot of promising things happening in the field of citizen science, where governments are working closely with citizens to design public policy. There's plenty of examples in this part of the world. There's plenty of examples starting to come in the global south as well. I think tangible examples, because we have to stop saying things like, it's a mixture of everything. It's top down and bottom up. Everyone needs to be involved, because when it's everything, it's nothing. And it becomes very difficult for individuals to know what they should do next. So I think good examples, narratives, well told, well packaged, and delivered to different audiences, I think. But now, because now is a really opportune time, I think, for shifting norms. Yeah.
Anders, want to
Well, the future will, to a large extent, be decided by what's happening in what we call developing countries. That's where the majority of the population live, and it's increasing. And I think one of the major problems over the last 20 years when we've had these negotiations, both with regard to biodiversity and climate change, is that the rich countries, and we belong to them, we have not been ready to put enough support on the table. I mean, we know that we should invest 4 to 5 times more every year in renewable technology in developing countries. Otherwise, they are stuck in the coal economy. Because without energy, without access to energy, modern energy, there is no development. So there is no substitute but alternative energy. And that's not happening. That's simply not happening. And we have to scale it up. And there I think Sweden could take the lead. And I've been talking to Peter Eriksson about it. I think we could, for instance, offer investment guarantees to a much larger extent than we do, because that's what's really lacking. So north-south is very important. Secondly, we talk a lot about the circular economy. I don't like the terminology, but not because nothing is 100% circular. But anyway, we know that we have to manage materials in a different way. One way to go about it in terms of responsibility is what we call extended producer's liability responsibility. That those producing something own it until the bitter end. So they are responsible not only to sell it and then say thank you, but really to the bitter end. Then I can assure you things will be designed very differently. Because they would be interested in earning revenue as long as possible on what they have already produced. And they would also know that at the end of the story, we have to take care of the residue materials and the waste materials. Now they are externalizing it on society. So there are some fundamental principles that we can apply to this that would make things very, very different. And finally, we have the SDGs. If we would follow them in an integrated way, that would be fantastic.
Those are some really good concrete examples. Sverker, would you like to come in briefly before we go to the audience?
Extremely briefly to say that I think narratives are important, but perhaps we could also see our own lives as narratives that are strong narratives, that are narratives that impact on other people. They don't need to go to the bookstore or go on the web. They can actually see what happens nearby. And I think that is what is happening with, for example, solar cells, and that is happening with electric cars in Norway. So we can look at a number of, so to speak, lived narratives where people actually do change. And there is a certain power in that change because we seem to be psychologically working in such a way that when 3 out of 4 around you have solar cells, you have this sense that you should have it too. Because if the others get it and they keep using it, that's evidence almost that it works. So I've been actually changing my mind on this point. I used to be among those people who say, you know, the argument is like this. If you want a better defense, that's not a household issue. We don't go out and collect some weapons to strengthen or we don't start building a railway otherwise, because it's a bad infrastructure. That's a political decision. We say the same must be true for climate, the same must be true for the environment. And of course, it is to a certain extent true, but it's also true that these things won't happen unless you also do something for yourself. You have to build opinion. You have to be part of it. And I think that is the encouraging thing that you talk about. I think we see things actually right now happening, certainly with the aura of Greta as sort of the beacon here. But I think many places things are happening that are going the right way. I see people around me in my own workplace where people stop flying or at least scale down on it and make cumbersome journeys by train and boat to get places, or organize. When we organize conferences now, we always have the remote participants. It's gone quickly in just a couple of years. It's gone from almost 0 to, yeah. So you get my point.
Great, thank you so much. I know that we only have time for 1 or 2 questions in the audience. Please feel free to, there are microphones close to where you sit. Maybe, are there any sort of burning questions that you would like to address to Sverker or to the panel? Yes, over there. You need to turn the mic on. Yeah. Yes, now it is, I think.
I have to hold it all the time.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. My name's Tom Bigg. I'm with the International Institute for Environment and Development in the UK. I just wanted to pick up on one element. It's a fascinating discussion. Thanks very much, and a really interesting panel. One element that didn't come through strongly, which is obviously a key factor over that time period since the Stockholm conference in particular, which is around development and the connections with environment. So the notion of improvements, particularly in Asia, Africa, Latin America, to achieve higher standards of living, to address extremes of poverty, etc., which was present very strongly in the Stockholm conference itself. Indira Gandhi said poverty is the greatest form of pollution. So right at that point, the extension of the concept of environment to human suffering, to human inequality, was integral to the framing then of a conference on environment. My organization was set up around that time and is on environment and development. So we've also tracked that period. So that's a really interesting juxtaposition, which didn't come through that strongly from the panel discussion up until now. So I'm interested to get your perception on that in terms of those concepts and how they also feed into some of the narrative you have now on the potential for narratives and solutions. Because one of the other things that didn't come through strongly for me either was the sense that many narratives, many of the kind of articulations of environment come from completely outside Western culture. We didn't hear anything yet about China's role on many of these issues, and obviously China is a huge global player in a whole spectrum of different ways, but has a very strong narrative around the notion of eco-civilization, which is one of the primary framings for China's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative. Now, there are many serious questions about that initiative, but clearly the integration of a strong ecological focus within it is an important component to engage with. So, again, a challenge perhaps for some reflections on the global nature of this conceptualization and how perhaps that's a source of some of the narratives for the future.
Thank you. Sverker, would you like to go first and then, yeah?
I tried to touch upon it because I said the north-south dimension is very important. And I think you have to look at underprivileged people wherever they are and realize that unless this transformation is just, it's not going to happen. And we saw the yellow vests in Paris. It was a complex background, but one of the triggering factors was an increase in the taxation of diesel, and at the same time a reduction in the inheritance or wealth tax. So that just shows that there is a dynamic there. Piketty, a couple of months before the Paris conference, came out with a little booklet looking at per capita emissions, not in countries, but income groups. And he had singled out the 3 million richest Americans, the 1% with the highest income in America. And he estimated they had a carbon footprint of 318 tons per capita. And normally you say rich people don't matter because they are so few. Well, 318 tons times 3 million, that's 1 billion tons. That's 2.5% of global emissions. And then if you add the rich in India, in Europe, in China, etc., you have a challenge. And so I think rich and poor, yes. Developing countries, yes. Very, very important. What you do is very important. But it's also a question in our own countries. And we have to do this in a just way.
Mm-hmm.
What's just?
Well, that it's looked upon as fair. We shouldn't leave anyone behind. We should really try, and we have to take care of the losers. I mean, you saw in the paper today that Poland is objecting to the more ambitious EU goals in the climate. Well, I've been in Poland many times. There are hundreds of thousands of people in the Katowice region who depend 100% on coal. Not only for energy, but for a lot of aggregates, etc. So unless we are ready to reach out, it's going to be a fight.
Yes, I think because of connecting to Ole's question about what is fair or just might be this sort of trade-off between even achieving some SDGs might have negative implications on the others. Is there time for one more question in the audience, or maybe not? No? Okay, then I would like to thank you all very much, and especially the panelists, for a great discussion. Thank you.
And we have a very small gift for you as well, so please stay on the stage. So my name is Persson. I'm Research Director and Deputy Director of SEI. And I promise I will be a very short blip on the curve for this seminar, because there is a very nice mingle waiting outside. Very nice, some foods and drinks to continue this really exciting discussion, which turned from expertise to really being about values and being the change as well that we want to see. So I just wanted to pick up on a few things to provide some concluding remarks. Sverker, you talked about pluralization of the environment as a concept, and I think beyond celebrating our 30 years as an institution, SEI, we have also this year been quite busy preparing our new 5-year strategy. And as part of that, we did our history homework as well, looking at the Stockholm Declaration coming out of the 1972 conference, and we can see so much sustainability of principles on sustainability. They were basically the same back then that we now see in Agenda 2030. So I think, in a way, we are also a champion of consistency here, trying to keep our eyes on the targets, the environment and development challenges that need to be resolved. But also, of course, picking up on this very important point about putting words to these new social narratives of transformation. And I think this lecture on history that you gave us today was a very good reminder that we need to think very carefully about time as well as we develop that narrative. What is how quickly or how slowly do things need to happen now in this, if it's a decade that we have at our disposal? This is also scientifically debated, of course, but it's a very short time frame we have now. In what sequence do things need to happen? What can actually be disruptive, change quickly, and what needs to take a longer time to be properly socially and politically anchored? So thank you very much for reminding us of these important historical perspective. And I wanted to just finish off reflecting a bit as well on this green spirit that you mentioned that sort of seems to exist in these nice buildings in Stockholm, which is host to many institutions, university, institutes, funders, government agencies. I was in New York last week at the Climate Summit, and a British policymaker in the Foreign Office, he said to me, well, so many Stockholm named institutes in the speaker list, you're really punching above your weight. And I was first a bit offended. Is he suggesting we're lightweights? But I think it was really a compliment and a testament to the fact that it's not just about single institutes, but it's about these ecosystems of universities, institutes, funders, government agencies that really support having this green voice and a green evidence-based voice, I would add. So with that, I want to again thank the speakers today and the moderator. And I want to thank the Royal Swedish Academy of Agriculture and Forestry for hosting us today. And of course to our two partners for organizing these annual Gordon Goodman seminars, Stockholm University and the Royal Academy of Sciences. And finally, my colleagues at the Stockholm Environment Institute, in particular, Anneli Sundin, who's been organizing this today. So please enjoy the mingle, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.